in every conversation, his expectation of sincerity and that we can talk straight about real issues, and this doesn't just have to become an inflammatory, reactionary confrontation was remarkable.
It's this great quality that he has that at any kind of a social gathering or a party or whatever, it's like he'll turn around and start talking to you, and within like 2 or 3 minutes, he'll be like going deep into like the biggest questions of life and death and the meaning of life and all that sort of thing, and really meaning it. Like he's just sort of all in, wants to talk about that stuff. And
Yep.
his, like you were saying, the default sort of sweet, naive assumption is that, well, doesn't everyone want to do this with me? You know?
Yes. And that's, I relate to that so deeply. I feel like that's something that me and my group of friends that I grew up with, we didn't even realize it was unusual, probably because we were homeschooled. This is Matt Garnier, and you're listening to the Liberty Way podcast. Today's guest is the brilliant Esther O'Reilly. She is a Christian apologist, writer, and as she calls herself, a Christian humanist. She was an early commentator on the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and she's participated in religious debates with several prominent non-religious scholars. She is as perfect a guest as I could possibly curate for the listening audience who've identified themselves up to this point. So it's fitting that this is the final episode under our existing label, the Liberty Way podcast. The Liberty Way has brought us an incredible amount of support and listenership, and I remain a fan of their work, which is still thriving at the Liberty Way on Instagram. But I want to remind listeners that this podcast was only ever connected to the community in and around Liberty University, not the university itself. And my personal severance with the university has beautifully converged with a new direction opening up for the podcast. So if you're currently following or subscribed to the podcast, or if you do that right now, you will remain connected to the rebranded version of my podcast, which will launch in a matter of days. And because some of the listening platforms take their time to update images, it might still show up as the Liberty Way podcast for a while. Some of them only just updated from the old time podcast hour, in fact. So as of the release of this episode, we are at Liberty Way Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and the Liberty Way podcast on Facebook and all of our listening platforms, which include Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Please enjoy the final Liberty Way podcast as hosted by Matt Garnier with Esther O'Reilly. I became familiar with you via the Unbelievable podcast from the UK's premier Christian radio, which it's pretty cool to see you as this recurring guest on that show. There's no particular accolades that they seem to attribute to you, except that you are able to hang with the big ones on that show. Can you share with me like how you got connected with Unbelievable?
Well, I've known Justin for a really long time, so nepotism pays. No, I'm just kidding. Well, so it was because of my writing on the whole Peterson phenomenon, specifically one piece in particular in July of 2018 when I was analyzing Peterson's debates with Sam Harris. And that's when Christians were beginning to kind of realize that the Peterson moment was kind of a big thing, and that maybe we should try to get a little bit of a piece of the action. And I tried to be as a little bit ahead of the curve there, and actually wrote that article before the official release of the debates was out. I was listening to a bootleg version so that I could write it as quickly as possible. And then that got shared around quite a bit. And so then the first time I was on Unbelievable, I was talking with this secular humanist guy who I'd never heard of before, but Justin knew him really well and had some kind of an idea that we could have some sort of a conversation about Jordan Peterson, which ended up being kind of a mashup of different things and had no really clear direction. It was fun though. But so that wasn't like the world's best organized matchup necessarily.
Well, neither was Jordan Peterson's first talk with Sam Harris, as I recall it.
Yeah,
if you remember that.
Right, that's true. But like it was kind of funny because my opponent was like forcing himself to watch the debates and going, oh, ugh, ah, I hate this, because Peterson was triggering him as a leftist in all kinds of ways. And so we wasted a bunch of time with me trying to explain why Peterson isn't misogynistic and, you know, stuff like that.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other debate.
But then much better was my New Year's talk with Douglas Murray this year, and that had been kind of a long time in the planning. We'd been wanting to get Douglas on the show for a really long time. I had kind of moved on and begun looking at Douglas's work after studying Jordan's work, because I was getting into the whole kind of intellectual dark web group of people, and I found Douglas really interesting as well. And I thought that he had a very interesting relationship with Christianity and faith, that he seemed to be much more thoughtful than the typical new atheist Christopher Hitchens approach, even though he was the kind of guy who sort of should have followed in their footsteps in some ways. In some ways, he was sort of cut from the same cloth, but he took a much more interesting and open approach. So I had been kind of gunning for him for a long time, but his schedule was just so busy that it was hard to pin him down. But eventually we did, and then that went extraordinarily well.
Yeah,
and
that was phenomenal. I think you were the right Christian voice to bounce off of Douglas Murray, and really, I mean, I think the great thing about him is he's a very non-militant atheist, as opposed to maybe some of the others that you mentioned. So for those who don't know, Unbelievable is this debate format podcast, putting a Christian voice against generally an atheist. And in some cases, they're more willing than others to learn from each other. And it was cool how, I mean, approaching Douglas Murray, you were like this fangirl to have a good disagreement, you know, and it's not common enough. It's really refreshing to see that. And I think that's why you were the right voice for that moment. I don't remember what the first time was that I heard you on the show, but there was something
well,
about...
I just remembered myself. I was forgetting, leaving it out. I was also on with James Lindsay and my friend Neil Shenvi to talk about critical theory.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I have James Lindsay booked next week. So
interesting.
I'll have to catch up on that. That's really cool.
The thing is about those two, the ones is that one with Lindsay and Shenvi, and then this one with Douglas, is there were some people writing in to complain that there wasn't enough disagreement with the atheist because it's like, wait a minute, I thought this was a debate show. It's like, well,
yeah, well, Lindsay is well versed in religious studies and kind of researching the epistemology and psychology of religion. So I think he's capable of taking multiple sides, at least in terms of understanding them.
And in that particular context, we were basically discussing politics, and like, you know, the whole grievance studies hoax and the Sokol squared and that kind of thing. And I mean, we were really all on the same page as far as that was concerned. So there wasn't a whole lot for us to clash over, except I did make one attempt, because James has this theory. He sort of compares the epistemology of critical theory with some versions of like Reformed epistemology, or maybe presuppositionalism, or like ways of combining Christianity with epistemology that privilege a certain worldview or a point of view stance. And so I was trying to kind of make the case that there's nothing inherently about Christianity that forces you to apply that kind of an epistemological frame, and that in fact you can be a Christian in a very rational evidentialist kind of way. But then he didn't really disagree with that either, and so it was like, oh, so you don't have anything to disagree about, do we? So that was like my one attempt there in that conversation to generate a slight degree of tension. And then similarly, I was hoping with Douglas that I might get into a little bit more of contrasting, like why I do believe and why he doesn't believe. But we only kind of touched on that in the last third, and he was sort of ducking and weaving a little bit, and kind of surprised me with a couple of things he said. where I felt like, so close. Like we didn't get to talk for nearly long enough.
Well, I think maybe a central theme in a lot of these interreligious conversations is trying to define belief in the first place. It doesn't always come up explicitly. I know Dr. Peterson, would bring that up a lot. Just what does it actually mean to believe? What does God actually mean? So to have a really complete discussion usually takes more than the length of a podcast, but
True.
Sometimes it also seems to be totally neglected from the conversation. Maybe it goes hand in hand with some of the deconversion themes that you've hit on in both your writing and in these guests and opponents that you've talked to. So I do want to explore that a little bit because for at least a semi-full disclosure, I identify as Christian, which I used to do with much greater conviction. And then I would say that I deconverted, but I've been re-exploring the theme. And so I don't necessarily challenge whether or not someone considers me to be a Christian, but I'm very interested in where they draw that threshold, what different people's reasons are for leaving the faith or saying that they have. And so your article about specifically focusing on Rhett and Link really fascinated me because one of the things that you said was you feel that it's probably too late for them. What do you mean by that?
Well, I just kind of looking at them and the experience that I've had with friends and friends of friends who've gone through their own kind of deconstruction processes is that one does, you sort of learn to intuit the point of no return where somebody has just become so invested in their narrative and kind of invested in their rightness that they feel like they've kind of gone too far to reconsider and turn back, and they kind of get into this mentality of, well, I've been there, done that, I've seen it all, I've read it all, you don't have to send me stuff, like Rhett kept saying, no, don't send me book recs, I know all the arguments, I'm good. And if you say that, especially if you say it publicly, then it would be, egg on your face if you came back later like, oops, turns out I actually hadn't been there, done that, so there's a certain amount of pride in there. And one big factor that I got into in that article, which they kind of hammered on in both their testimonies, was the whole sexual morality, cultural revolution, specifically with LGBT issues, where they both decided that the Christian ethic of sexuality was just unkind and mean to gay folks, and that it was just basically part of being a good person to them to break with it, because they had friends who were gay, and in their eyes, it was just mistreating them not to affirm their lifestyle and their sexuality, and that's the sort of thing where, because it's so intensely personal, it's very, very difficult to do a turnaround on that, because we tend to be guided by our human connections. We're guided by our friendships. We're guided by intuition and instinct, sometimes even more so than a rationally laid out argument. I think those are often some of the most powerful things that function as the engine in these kinds of deconversion stories. And so listening to them talk that way about that, I thought, oh, wow, I don't see them coming back from that, because this is now, like, they feel like this is where they've personally staked out their territory.
Yeah, it's interesting. The process of deconstruction does kind of expose, for better or worse, what the most basic premise is or was in the belief system, which could be, in a belief, it could be just a natural inclination towards a certain morality structure, and then everything else is peripheral to that. Or it could be that there's evidence at the center. But as you said, there's all of these identity elements in play for everybody. So by the same token that at least one of them was saying, I'm pretty sure of this. Don't send me stuff. Don't you think that the same kind of pride is on the line for someone who says, I believe this is a conviction, it's unshakable?
Well, I mean, that is possible, and I would obviously encourage Christians to be open, and not to deliberately close themselves off from other resources. Um, Although what I personally tend to see more often with Christians is that they become fixated on the other extreme, and they begin to worry that unless they've like gone around turning over every possible stone, and trying to find every possible way of mounting an objection to the Bible or what have you, they can't really be confident. So they live in this kind of perpetual fear that there could always be that one knockdown skeptical argument out there that they just haven't found yet. So they have to kind of keep themselves in limbo until they've turned over every stone. And I don't think that's true, and I don't think that it's intellectually prideful or arrogant to have a kind of inductive approach to this, right? Where it's like I feel like I've sampled the loaf of bread in enough places, so to speak, that I'm going to pronounce this good, and I feel pretty confident in that pronouncement.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean, that doesn't mean that you have like a principled objection to reading more, but just that I think at a certain point it's okay to be a confident Christian.
Okay. But it sounds like you're saying that technically speaking, that may not ever be the case, that there isn't some theoretical perfect confidence. So then is it really so necessary to draw hard lines, either as a convert or a deconvert?
Well, of course, I'm a little bit of an epistemology / theory of knowledge nerd, so this is leads into a fascinating cluster of questions: what constitutes knowledge? What constitutes certainty? Can one have knowledge without certainty? All kinds of fun stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say, of course, you can't be certain of Christianity in the same way that you're certain that 2 + 2 = 4, that I'm certain of my own existence, that, these kinds of Cartesian absolutes. But you can be, maybe we could say, morally certain. You could have an extremely high degree of confidence. Perfection, you use the word perfect. Perfection is not the goal. Joseph Butler was an 18th century bishop divine, one of those great old dead guys that I like to wave around to recommend to people. And he has this great little quote that probability is the guide of life. So note that he says probability is the guide of life, not certainty. We go about our lives believing, trusting in things that aren't certain, but we believe them with a very high probability. And I think that Christianity is no different in that respect. So then it's okay if you're not certain in the technical sense, because you don't need to be.
I completely agree. And that is actually why I've chosen to begin erring on the side of calling myself Christian, is because in spite of uncertainty, I realize that nothing, and in fact, no person, as we say we know them, is by any shared upon definition. So, I choose to live by the claims that I hope are true rather than the ones that I fear, insofar as both are unprovable, unknowable. I believe, I forget which article you wrote this in, but you said, in quotes, Christianity is true may be one of those propositions on which all rational and completely informed people should, in principle, agree. By what definition of Christianity do you think it's that clear that it is intellectually agreeable?
So by Christianity, I mean, the full enchilada, so to speak, not just bare theism, but a robust Christian theism, that Christ was the incarnate Word of God, Word made flesh, that he died and rose again, that he was fully God and fully man, all that stuff, all that good stuff. So I think we have the wherewithal to make a robust case for that full suite of claims. I think it's well evidenced and rational, and there are many reasons why people disagree, but I think ultimately if you follow them out, the reasoning is always flawed in some way or other for rejecting it.
I do like that you advocate for inference being a tool that everyone should use. It's not just as you said, something for the geek squad, But do you think that properly understanding Christianity is contingent on having that set of tools, or do you think that there's like a bare understanding that is in some manner sufficient?
So I think maybe what you might be asking is it possible for somebody to be to have good reasons to believe, even if they don't think about their faith in a technical way?
Perhaps, and maybe like how much of a wager would still be a faith?
A wager?
A sense of grasping at this possible truth. If your epistemology is such that you don't want to nail something down as a certain knowledge, but it's hopeful for you, and to whatever extent that's a lot of cultural Christianity is just sort of, oh yeah, this makes good enough sense, or whatever sort of background it may come from. It's not always a deeply intellectually held belief, is what I'm trying to say. So,
oh yes, I completely agree there. And that's one thing that I like to try to disabuse people of who are shy of evidentialism, because one kind of a myth about what evidentialists think is that evidentialists think that only really smart people or really technically geeky people can have good reasons to believe that Christianity is true. And I don't believe that. I think many times you used the phrase it makes good sense. I think a lot of people intuit that Christianity makes sense without necessarily being able to make it precise. But their intuition is right, their instinct is right. And so I would say that they're still chasing something solid from a rational perspective. They still have at least the beginnings of a way of justifying what they believe. But I do think that it's a worthy exercise and a worthy enterprise for those people who are more technically inclined to see if they can make good instincts and good intuitions precise. And so that's not to say that the non-technical people don't have good reasons to believe, but it's just to say that I think Christianity scales, if I can put it that way. I think you can have good reasons at whatever level you want to play on, and if you wanted to go all the way up to the level of breaking out equations and getting mathematical and getting technical, that's fine too. You can do that. But I think there are also powerful intuitive arguments as well.
If I can borrow a phrase that you've used repeatedly, both talking about Rhett and Link and in other conversations, you've talked about a crisis of meaning, and that's perhaps part of what drives people to leave the faith. What do you mean by that? Why do you think that that's a sort of prevalent condition right now?
Right. So I have a friend named Paul Vanderklay, who's a Calvinist pastor out in California, and he's also really interested in the whole Peterson phenomenon and what's kind of come in its wake. So he has a cool YouTube channel if you want to go check that out. So of course, as a pastor, he has a lot of hands-on experience with this kind of thing, and he's been doing some really interesting kind of cultural analysis of how things have shifted and changed, and how old institutions, old ideas have crumbled, and you see generational divides widening and that kind of thing. And Douglas Murray has also addressed this, like in The Strange Death of Europe, in particular, I think, a sense of rootlessness that I think many people have these days growing up in the modern world. They no longer feel connected to a heritage, to a past, to a faith. All of those kind of old norms that people used to take for granted have been sort of whittled away and eroded. And it's a process that it hasn't happened overnight. It's happened over many, many years, and maybe best poetically captured in Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach. This sad romantic image of the tide going out and things just crumbling and being lost. And so I think that's what you see with younger people in particular who deconvert, that they just aren't able to kind of sign on the way that their parents or their grandparents were. But then, of course, there's this fear, and Rhett and Link discuss this too. It's like, oh no, I'm jumping out of this boat into the sea, and maybe I'm taking my family with me, and I don't really know where I'm going. But hey, man, maybe it's going to be okay. Methinks they doth protest too much there, but that's its own kind of discussion. But yeah, I think that's what we're up against. And the Peterson moment sort of interestingly highlighted that, because his whole brand was, here's how you can find meaning in your life, without necessarily pitching his message as a Christian message, even though he was a preacher in some sense. But he was trying to kind of speak into that meaning crisis for younger guys in particular, but really for anyone who was feeling that. And what was fascinating is the way that he was able to succeed without sort of going by conventional Christian routes or a conventional Christian approach to the Bible. He was still able to tap into that sort of ancient wisdom and that ancient power to convict people and to orient people.
Yes, I definitely think that Peterson has there's almost a spiritual driving force. There's a sense that in a way he is embodying something Christian. And I want to come back to that in a second, but just on the definition of meaning here, I just think that what Rhett and Link and others like them are following by kind of going down this honest route of what ends up being a deconversion. I don't think that they are abandoning the search for meaning, if that's what you meant to imply. I don't know, but I think that they're hoping that there still is, in a very spiritual sense, a deeper meaning to be found, something that's like the meaning they found in religion. But even I think Rhett quoted a phrase that I use often: "All truth is God's truth," where he's saying, wherever this takes me, if I'm searching genuinely, and when you've come from a place of believing it from a religious perspective, it's hard for anything to replace that, but still hopeful that there is something.
Yeah. Right. And I didn't mean to say that they were abandoning the search for meaning, but just that they're hoping to find it somewhere else, and trying to replace the meaning that they had found in church structure, in religious structure, with some other structure. The problem is that I think as human beings, we need a structure. We need some kind of a frame for sense making, for meaning making. And if it's not Christianity, it'll turn into something else, and that could be any number of things. It could be politics, for example. So that's, you can see there's a kind of a religious quality to many of these political ideas, political movements that people are turning to as they abandon religious structures. Right.
And it's fascinating what Peterson did with that, because he merged what felt like almost these two different characters of Jordan Peterson, the self-help guru and the kind of archetype scholar, into what felt to a lot of people like a religion, but it was so focused on a practical sense of meaning, just having purpose and trajectory within your own life. And whatever became controversial about that, I think, was largely a misconstruction. But I don't know. I want to talk about Peterson, but I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, that's a big topic.
It definitely is. I guess as far as your personal commentary goes, well, you've said a lot on Unbelievable around that. I think you did a full episode, in fact, talking about Jordan Peterson. And you were one of the journalists to write about the incident sort of at Liberty University, where a lot of our listeners are, which
Yeah.
of course I remember well. And that was, it was bizarre to everyone, but there was so many different, I think, kind of angles from which to look at that. You know, it feels like an unfortunate event kind of in a way, but then it also brought out a bigger point, which was like that this man has become a savior figure in a way to a lot of people. And it did evoke some kind of empathy, and but you can see how what a burden that could be for Dr. Peterson.
Absolutely. I felt that really intensely when I watched that, and you could see how genuinely concerned he was and moved that this mixed up kid, was like clinging to him and looking to him to be, some kind of a Messiah figure almost in a way, or like, you think about, I couldn't help going back to like the New Testament where Jesus is walking by and Bartimaeus says, Master, help me, I'm blind, and sometimes when people would do that with Jesus, the disciples would be like, go away, Rabbi's busy. And then Jesus would say, no, I want to help this person. It's okay. The problem is that Jordan Peterson isn't Jesus. And so he can't fill that role. He can't be that to every mixed up kid in the world. But I got the impression from watching him like he was almost trying to be, while knowing that he couldn't be at the same time. And that will crush you. I mean, it'll just, and it kind of did in a way, you could say.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. What do you think really separates Jordan Peterson from the pack, especially just during that initial heyday? What gave him that moment and made him kind of the man of the hour, especially for young men?
Yeah, I mean, it really was just a perfect storm of factors. I think there was a certain almost oblivious quality about him, that he was just so distinctive, just so unlike anyone else, and didn't really care that he was unlike anyone else.
Yeah.
That people were drawn to that. I think people are generally drawn to authenticity, to a sense of bespokeness, if I can put it like that. He was kind of weird. People liked that. It had a kind of a magnetic quality. But he also had like a paternal authority about him, and so he had like decades and decades of practical, hands-on psychological experience working with people, learning about human nature. So that gave him this incredibly penetrating insight where people would listen to him and think, oh my gosh, how did he know? He's right. Wow. Okay. I have to go home and rethink my life. And so it was just the combination of being an iconoclast, being a maverick, but also genuinely caring about people, being able to communicate effectively, and then I think the way he drew on the Bible, the way he drew on religion, is something that it's sort of unheard of for thinkers and speakers who aren't within the church. I remember when my friend Paul Vanderklay first found his biblical lectures on YouTube. At first he thought, oh, what is this? Did some Christian slip through the gatekeepers at University of Toronto? And then he keeps listening. He goes, oh no, he's definitely not a Christian. He's just different. Wow. Okay, I gotta keep listening to this guy. And so he was able to somehow harness the Bible, which is something that no one else had ever tried, and do it in a way that no one else had ever done it. And of course, I believe the Bible is inspired. I think that the Bible does have the power to speak into people, and it was in a sense sort of waiting for somebody to pick it up and harness it in that way, in a way that people would tune into. So, I could go on, but
Yeah.
all of those things coming together. And then, as far as why he became like a household name, there was a certain amount of luck involved as far as his relationship with the media. There were certain clearly identifiable bumps, so to speak. So the whole Bill C-16 thing was a bump. And then the Kathy Newman interview was a bump. And those were in some sense freak occurrences. So I don't know that he would have become quite the phenom that he did without some of that chance element involved.
Yeah. It's funny that you use the word oblivious right off the bat, because
Yes.
I don't know that he even would have noted the big bumps that surged him to fame, but I don't think it changed him at all. And I think another thing that he was kind of, sweetly oblivious to was how much good faith he was extending to an almost unsustainable degree in every conversation. His expectation of sincerity, and that we can talk straight about real issues, and this doesn't just have to become an inflammatory, reactionary confrontation, was remarkable. You're not used to seeing it, especially in like a talking head setup.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, that faith would prove to be misplaced, of course, as we know, more than once.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that was certainly something I was immediately drawn to. And a friend of his wrote the foreword to the 12 Rules book, saying that it's this great quality that he has, that at any kind of a social gathering or a party or whatever, it's like he'll turn around and start talking to you, and within like 2 or 3 minutes, he'll be like going deep into like the biggest questions of life and death and the meaning of life and all that sort of thing, and really meaning it. Like he's just sort of all in, wants to talk about that stuff. And
Yep.
his, like you were saying, the default sort of sweet, naive assumption is that, well, doesn't everyone want to do this with me?
Yes. And I relate to that so deeply. I feel like that's something that me and my group of friends that I grew up with, we didn't even realize it was unusual maybe until a later age, probably because we were homeschooled. There was just sort of
Me
this
too.
expectation that you don't have a filter. Okay. And that's something that did not surprise me. I don't remember where I picked up that you were homeschooled. I kind of got that sense from the start that there was something we must have shared in our background. Just by the way you talked, I was like, I know that there's something either we went to school together or we just both were homeschooled. So there's the confirmation. Yeah. What do you think it is that makes homeschoolers so distinctive? Like you kind of know when you see one, and it's not always a bad thing.
Well, we tend to be nerdier, which is could be a good thing. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense at all. Yeah, I mean, we tend to have. I mean, I really do think that we tend to be better read, contrary a certain kind of a bigoted popular assumption that, oh, well, if you're homeschooled, and that means that girls were forced to wear skirts, and you can only learn history from Bob Jones or whatever. I don't know. This silly stereotypical views.
Yeah.
That really make it more like unschooling. But yeah, I mean, I think we tend to be well-rounded. I think another element that's a very common pattern I see is that we tend to relate well with people who are much older than we are, and sometimes we even feel like we're more at home with older people than with people of our same age group, unless they were also homeschooled. And that's, in an odd way, I think that's one reason why I got along so well with Douglas Murray, because obviously he wasn't homeschooled, he went to Eton. But it was this weird sense in which it's like I was on the same wavelength with this extremely posh, Eton and Oxford educated young guy, because he's also an old soul, and he'll also talk about how most of his friends are older than he is, and how you're missing out on not drawing from the wisdom of the past, the wisdom of older people. And that's something that I think is very much woven into the fabric of homeschooling, is drawing on the past and being rooted in being rooted in something that's older and bigger than yourself, instead of chasing after current cultural fads.
Yes, I agree. And I also think that in any kind of mainstream context, especially public school, there's going to be certain structures imposed, which you just sort of accept as reality. You know, it's us against maybe these just sort of seemingly arbitrary systems, and that may very well be good training for the real world. But there's also a certain freedom that you experience in being able to just interact with your own unfiltered reality. And it's a different kind of life training that you experience as a homeschooler. And at some point there's a shocking kickback when you realize that it's not like that everywhere. You know, people have put their peers into boxes, and, you know, groups are divided by along just lines that make no sense. But different realities. And I don't regret being homeschooled. For its,
there's the bespoke quality that I was mentioning earlier, that it was what kind of drew people to Peterson. When your parents are educating you and you're kind of free from whatever the fad of the day is in the one size fits all public school system, you're able to develop your own kind of quirks, your own frame, your own way of looking at things. So then I think that ultimately makes you a more interesting thinker, that you think for yourself more.
Yes. And, frankly, I think that's kind of what makes you such an interesting person to have on these shows and interacting with these well-known people, is that you've got just kind of a self-directed pursuit of knowledge that it's just, it doesn't have to come from a certain set of qualifications. It's this like self-evident, she can speak for herself, she can induce certain realities. And that's, I mean, you don't see enough of that, because everyone wants a clear through line of here's who this is, here's exactly what they are and where they came from. And it's all pretty accessible, you know, if you just let yourself go there. But beyond that, what else defines you and your work?
So one phrase that I use for myself is that I like to call myself a Christian humanist. That's something that I actually developed. There was a new book of essays on Jordan Peterson that just came out called Myth, Meaning, and Jordan Peterson. It was put out by Lexham Press in Canada. It's, you didn't hear me say this, but it's a slightly dated essay collection now, because so many of the contributors were like writing in the heyday, in the heat of the Peterson moment, and then it got kind of delayed going to press. So now it's a bit of a time capsule. But I took the opportunity to develop how I see Peterson as a humanist thinker, and ways that Christians can think about stealing humanism back, so to speak, to be kind of have a kind of a Francis Schaeffer approach to it. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by humanism? Well, my motto is that Christianity is the true humanism, or the original humanism. So that if you're a real humanist, you're Christian in mentality, whether you admit it or not. This is something that Tom Holland, writer, historian, has been getting into recently, like in his book Dominion, which I would recommend. It's quite a good read. Which is kind of pointing out that if you want to call yourself a humanist while rejecting Christianity, you kind of sawing off the branch that you were sitting on. So for me, what it means to be a humanist is to recognize the infinite value of the human individual. But a human individual, well, why are humans valuable? What confers value on a human being? Well, I would argue that ultimately you have to trace that back to a God who confers the value, and that without that, you're sort of left with this overwhelming instinct that humans are valuable, which I encourage in people. I encourage that in non-Christians as well. But then I encourage them to keep going. Go back to the source of that, try to find the ontology of the intuition.
So what would the ontology of that intuition be? That God has assigned value. Is it just on the basis that we are made in His image? And do you have a way of defining that?
Yes, I would say that the image of God, the imago Dei, whatever phrase you want to use, that's the seat of human value. It's what distinguishes us from from other animals. And now I think that imago Dei is not always well or clearly understood, even in some Christian circles. And I think it's very tied as well with teleology. What's the purpose of the human person, not just of the human mind, but also of the human body. So that's something that I would recommend, a book called Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, where she kind of goes into the sort of Gnostic split between body and mind that we see happening today. And I hate to kind of evolution juke this, because that's a very touchy third rail issue, but these kinds of questions do kind of rub up against the evolution question, because it rubs up against whether there's a clean cut, so to speak, between the human person and the animal person as far as the physical emergence or the physical development of our bodies is concerned. So I think that eventually you kind of have to think about that and address that, because I think what it means to be made in the image of God is that we are made both body and soul in the image of God, which means that the human body has a particular purpose, has a particular function, in a way that a body of a great ape does not.
So do you hold to kind of a dichotomist view of body and mind, or body and soul? Are the lines clear for you?
Well, so I am a dualist. I am a Cartesian dualist. So I don't go for the sort of hylomorphic thing. Although some of my best friends are hylomorphists. But so yeah, and that's another thing that people can get confused about, because sometimes if you say that you're a dualist, people get nervous and think that you're like on the road to Gnosticism or something, just because you believe that that body and soul are separate things. I don't think that follows. I think you can acknowledge that body is one substance and soul is another substance, while still being like a robustly interactive Cartesian dualist. That body and soul are very tightly interconnected. So does that answer your question? Is that what you were asking?
Well,
yeah.
A further question though is your understanding of soul close to your understanding of consciousness?
Yeah, well, I mean that would be its own kind of discussion. And now I do think, well, I mean, I think animals have consciousness. Other animals have consciousness as well.
But not soul?
But yeah, I wouldn't say they have a soul in the sense that humans have a soul. So you could say that the essence of human mind, or the essence of human consciousness, is that it has a spiritual dimension that an animal would lack.
And I know we could push on this forever, but I wonder if you can nail down any trait of the spiritual quality that transcends the brain, or at least what points you to seeing that must exist.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't even need to go spiritual to do that. I mean, I think you could be an atheistic Cartesian dualist. Yeah, I mean, as far as that goes, I think the existence of mind is it's just one of those self-evident things. Then you could get into questions of the soul and the spiritual later, but I don't even think you need to go there to transcend the brain.
Okay, I will accept that.
Richard Fumerton would be a good name to check out there.
I'll make note of that. Esther, what should we plug and reference listeners to become more familiar with your work and maybe uncover whatever you're most proud of out there?
Good question. So I'm a freelance writer. I don't have like an official byline anywhere or a column anywhere. So I just kind of wander all over the place, forlornly pitching things to different places, hoping they'll take me. But so the best place to kind of keep up with me would be my Twitter. So that's my handle is Esther OReilly. And I have a blog, which I don't update nearly as much as I should, but that's Young Fogey at Pathos. And that has some of the work that I'm most proud of. But then other things that I'm proud of are kind of scattered at places like Gillette or Art Digital, places like that. But I list most of the outlets where I published stuff in my Twitter bio, so you can just kind of browse around and find that. I've also written some stuff at Premier Christianity for Justin. So he's got these big conversations that he does, and that sometimes he would commission pieces from me, breaking those down. So I'm quite proud of some of those pieces as well. So yeah, I'm just kind of all over, but Twitter is where I most frequently update things, and it's the place where you'll see any new things that I do. And then I already mentioned this essay anthology on Jordan Peterson. So that's out now on Amazon. It's called Myth and Meaning. Ron Dart is the editor, and I'm very proud of the essay that I wrote in there as well.
Excellent. You think there's a chance you'll ever author a book or lead a show of some kind, or what would be the dream to have your name attached to?
Well, actually, I have some essays that I'd like to put together in a book, but I feel like I don't have enough yet. And then sometimes I'll hit writer's block where I just won't write for a really long time. But I think that some kind of essay collection will happen. I was actually in talks with Lexham Press to do that, and then it kind of fell through. And I didn't make up the balance of essays I would need to write to put that together. So that's something I'd like to do at some point. I also have vain hopes of writing a novel someday, but everyone does. So I'm not unusual in that respect.
But you are more motivated than most. I look forward to whatever's next. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. I know we kind of went all over the place, but that's par for the course.
That's what I like to do. I would do it anytime.
Okay, good. Thanks so much, Matt. This was
all
fun.
right, thanks. Have a good one, Esther.
Have a good one.